So where did it all begin? It all began when Fleming discovered penicillin. He said when he accepted the Nobel Prize that he's already identified organisms that are resistant to penicillin. And if you give subtherapeutic doses or if you continue to expose to penicillin, you're going to get more resistant organisms because that's how bacteria survive. The weak ones die and the strong ones figure out ways just by selection pressure or developing different genes and plasmids and efflux pumps, ways to get around and survive even though that antibiotic is there. So it's a fact. You expose patients to antibiotics, you are going to get resistant organisms. The question is, how clinically significant is that? And that's where we struggle sometimes to find data, but there is some. So bacteria have evolved, they're extremely smart, they're here to survive. My guess is they'll out-survive humans, they'll still be here if we ever disappear, and they have a variety of different ways that they can engender resistance to different antibiotics. And there are differences between the organisms and the antibiotics in terms of the mechanisms that they use. And they are, in some cases, able to transfer different genes or snippets of genes and plasmids and things of that nature to other organisms, even if they're not necessarily in the same genus or species. And in other cases, that may not be what happens. And they often will package resistant genes together in groups. So they're not necessarily only passing on resistance to one antibiotic, they're passing it on to a variety of different antibiotics. This is happening even though we don't necessarily think we see it in the clinical setting. So where have all the antibiotics gone? We've seen an extremely slow development of antibiotics. And why has this been the case? Because after a while, it becomes very difficult to find something new and spend the time and money to develop an entire new class and see if it's going to work, if it's going to be safe and effective after millions of dollars of investing, which most of the time does not pan out when you're trying to go through the development process or FDA approval. So it becomes easier over time for people that are developing antibiotics to say, hey, we've had success with that first generation of cephalosporins. Let's just play a little molecular roulette, and we're going to change it a little bit. We change the profile of organisms. Now we have an anaerobe that's responsive that wasn't before, so it becomes a hospital-based IV drug or something of that nature because it covers something different. But it doesn't take as long to play with compounds that are already there and develop new antibiotics. It's a lot harder and much more expensive to develop new compounds. It's not that people aren't doing it, but it's much more difficult and much more expensive to do. When's the last time you had a new compound, not a reformulation, but a new compound of an antibiotic brought to a dermatology office? It's been extremely uncommon over the last decade, maybe 2 decades. So this is a problem. We don't deal with it as much in the community as they do in the hospital, but it affects all of us. So there's been a very slow development of new antibiotics as time goes on, and we see organisms where we have more difficulty that do become pathogens and create problems for certain patients. Now, there's been a lot of mention in the literature, both regionally in the United States and around the world, to try to get people to be aware of antibiotic use and to think about it. And that's all I'm asking you to do. When you're prescribing an antibiotic, think about, do I really need it? If I'm treating an infection, have I identified that infection? It's amazing to me how many times I see patients that are on antibiotics and they had something that was purulent and it wasn't cultured. Well, it costs too much. The cost of a culture is minuscule compared to so many things that we do, but you can never be faulted for confirming the diagnosis. So I think it's extremely important. It's hard when you haven't and then you wish you had that information. A lot of times we get by without it, but it's those cases where we didn't have it and now the patient's been on 1 or 2 antibiotics and you can't even find out if there was a pathogen there or what it was. Now, the biggest problem we have is that antibiotics are appearing in other different areas other than by patients that are getting them. And the majority of antibiotic exposure is in cattle feed and in animal feed. And that's a significant part of the exposure that gets transferred to humans that contributes to antibiotic resistance. So we can say 70% or more of the exposure to antibiotics is in animals. We have nothing to do with that. We can't control that. Well, there are some measures that are starting. Unfortunately, in the United States, we're behind some other countries to curtail this. Okay? So annual antibiotic use in the United States, close to 8 out of 10 is due to livestock exposure. The rest is due to human exposure. So we fall within that 19.1%, but it's still significant.